Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Jacobs in the Education Department at GBH. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important and huge topic. This is just the tip of the iceberg tonight, but we hope this helps move you forward in understanding and supporting students in anti-bias and culturally responsive instruction. We are recording. You will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording, along with the link to a resource document that includes all of the resources and the links that we're mentioning tonight. It will also have a link to a survey. You'll also get that link to the survey at the end of this session, and also a link to the slides. So all of that will be available to you tomorrow in a follow-up email. We have Angelica in the chat from GBH Education, and she's going to be monitoring things and posting links and helping us keep on track. We want to acknowledge the funders for this and a lot of our work around culturally responsive teaching, and that's the Nellie Mae Education Foundation and the Virginia Wellington Cabot Foundation. And thank you very much to both of them. This is the fourth in a series that was funded by Nellie Mae and Cabot. And you will have the links to the recordings of two other webinars that were done in November and December. This one was just showcased a wonderful collaboration between Bates College and Lewiston Schools in Maine, where there are thousands of Somalian refugees that have changed the whole dynamic of Lewiston, which was a very depressed manufacturing city. And so the combination of Bates College and social studies teachers and students created an immigration curriculum, which they've been very generously shared. And so you'll have the link to that recording. And the other webinar that was part of this collaboration with the funders was done in November, and it featured the author and literacy expert Tracy Swinton Bailey, who founded Freedom Readers, which is a nonprofit organization, and wrote a wonderful memoir called Forever Free, a true story of hope in the fight for child literacy. And you'll have the link to that webinar also. GBH is Boston's PBS station. I'm assuming that many of you are familiar with us. We're the Boston station and the whole network of PBS stations across the country. We're a very large producing station, which means that we create a lot of the programming that you see on stations around the country. Shows like Masterpiece, Nova, Frontline, American Experience, lots of programs for kids, all originate in Boston. In the education department, we create resources, we research, we develop resources along with content experts and educators. And we are very interested, of course, in equitable learning and development of young people and adults. So that's what we're up to in the education department. And one of our major endeavors is the platform PBSLearningMedia.org. We co-founded it with PBS, we manage it with PBS, and it is a free platform offering thousands of resources for pre-K to 12 across the curriculum. We are very strong in social studies and science in particular, but across the curriculum, you will find resources. And this is the website where you will find many of the resources the presenters will be sharing with you tonight. And that brings us to our presenters. Steven Chen is our featured presenter. He's going to be kicking things off. He is currently the assistant head of school at Boston Latin. He's also a nationally certified facilitator. Prior to these positions, Steven he worked at Boston Public Schools as the Deputy Chief Human Capital Officer and the Director of Training and Accommodations. And what that means is he partnered with school and central office leaders to consult and coach bias-based incidents and to create a welcoming and inclusive environment for students and employees. Prior to joining Boston Public, Steven was a curriculum chair, curriculum specialist, and high school English teacher in Arkansas. And prior to that, he had a law career. He has a BA from University of South California and a JD from Boston College Law School. And welcome, Steven. Thank you. Karen Pleasant. Karen is a former educator ambassador with GBH prior to joining the faculty of Eagle Brook School, where she is now. She was the history department chair and international baccalaureate coordinator at Stoneleigh Burnham School in Greenfield, Mass. Her master's focus at Smith College was in 20th century world history, the modern Middle East, and US history. She loves to travel, and she has quite a list of trips that she has taken and hosted students. And outside of school, she is the co-captain of the Paradise City Dragon boat team and an active member of the Franklin County League of Women Voters. Welcome, Karen, and thank you. Leslie White is relatively new to us, and we're thrilled to have her. This is her rookie appearance on one of our webinars. Leslie is a former middle school science teacher and now a district science specialist, which means that she serves several urban schools in Duval County, Jacksonville, Florida, leading PD, coaching teachers, working with students in small groups. And her specialized focus is understanding the link between literacy and science. Her passion for education was ignited during her tenure at the Young Men's and Women's Leadership Academy, where she specialized in the all-male classroom, incorporating music, culture, and literacy strategies, and allowing her students to experience science in a way that made sense to them in their real lives. She has many awards, but her most recent is the 2021 Shell Urban Science Educator Development Award from National Science Teachers Association, and that is how we bumped into each other. So welcome, Leslie, and thank you. And last but not least, Annie is my colleague. She is at PBS Utah. She, prior to joining the public media world, she mentored pre-service elementary ed students and oversaw the teacher training lab at the University of Utah. She's been in education for over 20 years. She's taught classes in child development, mental health, anti-bias curriculum, and strengthening families. And she participates in advocacy work for child abuse prevention, mental health awareness, neurodiversity, and building affirming communities for LGBT children and teens. And welcome, Annie. Thank you. All right, so the plan is Steven is going to kind of lay the foundation for the understanding of anti-bias and culturally responsive teaching. And he will be able to respond to a couple of questions. He is aware of the questions that you posted. And by the way, thank you for doing that. I would say maybe 70% of you posted questions ahead of time. And what we're not able to get to, that will drive our future work, because now we really can see what teachers are asking about and the kinds of information they need. Steven is unfortunately not able to stay with us the entire time. So after his portion, he'll need to log off. And then we'll move to Karen, and then Leslie, and then Annie, who all have resources to share with you and stories to tell about them. I'll come back at the end, and then we're going to reserve some time for questions at the end. All right, Steven, I'm going to let you take it over.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's really, really great to be with everyone this evening. I'm excited to engage in this conversation with all of you. And when I say conversation, I really do mean that. So to kind of do some participation and to get some voice from the audience here, I want to make sure everyone's setting in the chat is turned to everyone rather than the hosts and panelists. So make sure it's set to everyone. And I'd like to get us started actually with just, if we're here talking about anti-bias and culturally responsive teaching, I think one of the key things we need to do before we start talking about this and diving into resources is to kind of have a baseline understanding of what are we talking about? What does that mean? So I'd love everyone to just take a minute, maybe a minute and a half in the chat, and I'll be reading them as they scroll up. What do we mean when we say bias? How do you define that? And there's no right answer. I'm just really curious to see what people in the audience are thinking. So I'm seeing preconceived notion. Ooh, I like Michael's talks about implicit versus explicit bias, right? And that's actually, those are really, really important distinctions to make that we can dive into a little bit. Chris talks about prejudice in favor or against someone, something, some idea. Jim, ooh, we're flying now. Let me see. Individual perception based in part on subjective experience. I really like the idea of talking about the subjective part of that. Your previous belief system, personalized the way we understand situations and ideas, conscious versus subconscious, again, the explicit versus the implicit. Jennifer talks about favoring ideas, the belief that one is better than the others, favoritism for someone or a group or prejudice against them. Tom talks about opinion, right? Anytime when we have an opinion that isn't an objective fact, could be bias. So as we are going through and seeing these definitions, what you'll see is there's a lot of commonalities between what we're seeing. But there's also a lot of nuances in each of these definitions. We don't have time to dive into one set definition for bias, but it is really, really important to note that when we're talking about this, it can get pretty complicated. So here's my next question, as we sort of kind of have at least a holistic idea of what everyone is thinking about. Why does this matter for educators? Why does this matter for our students? Why talk about this as a webinar topic? And I'd love for people to just get their ideas and kind of give me an idea why you're all here. So if you didn't get that question, it's just, why does understanding bias, why is knowing bias important for educators? And Maria talks super important to have an inclusive education, to do better. Jennifer talks about biases impacting our students. Recognizing our interactions with each other, recognizing our own subjective approach, right? Ellen talks about teaching world history. This is a really common thing in history books and in history curricula. It's important to acknowledge bias to reach all students. I love that. Sorry, I'm not reading every single one of these. They are coming fast and furious. So just picking a couple of ones that are coming in. Jeffrey actually does a little bit of internal self-reflection where he talks about learning about your own biases before talking about how it impacts your instruction. And actually, I'm going to transition from that last one. So thank you, Jeffrey, into our next slide. So Carolyn, if you can move to the next slide. So I spent some time thinking about, well, how are we going to find some definitions just to help us understand what we're talking about through the title of this workshop, which is what is an anti-bias education and what is culturally responsive pedagogy? And there's a lot of fruitful discussions that we could have about this, but just to keep us on the same sort of foundational understanding, I did find two definitions that I think will work for this workshop. And the first one is, when we talk about an anti-bias education, we're talking about an approach to teaching and learning designed to increase understanding of differences and their values, and to actively challenge bias, stereotyping, and all forms of discrimination in schools and communities. But when we're talking about culturally responsive pedagogy, now we're talking about engaging identities and identity issues across all groups and communities: gender, ability or disability, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, language, and nationality. Now, the first thing that I hope you all notice when you see these two definitions, and I know I haven't given you a chance to really digest this, is that these two seem very similar. In fact, there are a lot of people who will use anti-bias education and culturally responsive pedagogy sort of interchangeably. But I also think there's a really important nuance that we want to really pay attention to, which is when we're thinking about anti-bias education, we're really thinking about what the teacher does in terms of curriculum, in terms of how they are teaching students, and how they're challenging bias, how they're challenging stereotypes, and how they're bringing in representation, right? Whereas if we're thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy, we're also looking at it through the lens of the students that sit in our classrooms, right? We're looking at the identities of our students, whether or not it's their gender identity, their ability or disability, their religion, their sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, language, and nationality. In other words, what representations do we have in the education that we are providing to our students? And also, where are the places where we are opening up windows into experiences that our students can't see for themselves because they don't experience it? We're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but those are some foundational definitions that I think will help us kind of go through this presentation. So there is actually a framework that exists called the 7 forms of bias in instructional materials. If you're curious about this, I highly encourage you to Google it. The first Google the result is going to come up with the organization that came up with this, as well as a deeper understanding of this framework. If we had 2 days and 8 hours a day, we could do a really, really deep dive into the 7 forms of bias, and we could actually go through lots of curricular materials and use this framework to really understand where are the biases that exist in these materials. Unfortunately, I don't have 2 days or 16 hours to go through all of this. So I'm going to go through this very, very quickly, and we're going to just workshop and do a slighter deep dive on the first one, and that's invisibility. And when we talk about invisibility, it's one of the oldest forms of bias that we'll talk about. But what we're talking about is who isn't represented, right? Who isn't included in the curriculum. We'll talk a lot about that in a second. And then when we move forward into that, we also talk about another form, which is stereotyping, right? And this is, okay, so there are people represented, but how are we representing them? Are we replacing one person or one idea or a small sample of ideas? And we're now implying or putting all of those that characteristic into all members of that group. Another form of bias that you may see in your own materials is imbalance and selectivity. When we have a really, really complex issue, and instead of presenting the complexity of the issue, we'll present one interpretation of the issue, the situation, a group of people. I know that there's a couple history teachers in this room. We see that sometimes, especially in textbooks where they only give like a paragraph for what is a really complicated issue, right? The next piece that we have is unreality, which is a form of bias where we show instructional materials where this is really, really complicated. This is kind of messy. Sometimes it's really unpleasant. And so we're going to gloss over a little bit. And we have seen a lot of different textbooks and a lot of different curricular materials that really have a hard time. And a good example of that is how a lot of books present US history, particularly around slavery, right? Then we move into fragmentation and isolation. And this one's actually one that I have vivid memories of when I was in school. And that's when you have a whole textbook devoted to a subject. And then there is that one page, and I'm going to use science as an example this time, that one page, that one pullout that says notable women in science. And at first it seems like, oh, they're doing a good thing highlighting women, until you realize, wait a second, there's this one page that highlights the notable women, but the rest of the textbook actually doesn't talk about it anymore, right? And so instead of talking about these people through the context of they've been part of, you know, this group or these people have been part of the development of this topic, you sort of put it aside and separate it. Then we go into 6, which is linguistic bias, which is how we use words, how we use language, right? How we describe people. And then finally, the last one, cosmetic bias, or the illusion of equity. So for instance, you'll have a textbook that has a ton of diverse people or a ton of diverse things on the cover. But when you actually go into the textbook, it's actually presenting things with a lot of problematic portrayals or viewpoints. Again, I know this is a ton to dive into, and I don't have time to go through all of them, but I do encourage all of you to look into this and also know there is a framework that already exists, so you don't need to make this from scratch. You can move on to the next. So as I said, we're going to do a quick dive into one of these forms of bias. And invisibility is one of the most fundamental and oldest forms of bias in instructional materials. And it talks about the complete or relative exclusion of a group. So I use 2 examples here that you can see on this slide, which is I never learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act ever in my entire education until I got to grad school and I went to law school. That was the very first time that I had learned that such a law existed, right? And then on the bottom, you also have another example of Black Wall Street, right? I never learned about that. And in fact, I didn't learn about it until fairly recently when that came out. So textbooks published prior to the 1960s largely omitted African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans from both narrative and illustrations. We like to think that our textbooks today have improved, and I would argue that they have improved, but they're still far from perfect. Women, people with disabilities, the LGBTQ plus community, they're missing from a lot of today's text. They're missing from a lot of today's materials. And what that does is it creates this void where people don't see themselves, they don't see their identities, they don't see their experiences reflected in the education and the everyday experience of what they're experiencing in school. You can move to the next slide, Carolyn. And what we can see here is, this is also true in the K-5 space, right, with children's books, where if you look, and this is data from 1994 to 2017, where we look at the number of children's books which are about people of color and or Native people, right? And so when we look at the United States, and this is slightly old data because it comes in 2017, but at the time, 37% of the US population are people of color. And yet, over the last 24 years, 13% of the children's books that have been published contain multicultural content. That's gone up a little bit if you look up into 2015, 2016, and 2017, but it's still largely a gap, right? And when we look at this, I put this quote here from Rudine Sims Bishop, who talks about this, and she's a professor at Ohio State and a children's book writer. And she says this: books are sometimes windows offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. I really want us to sit with this for a second. It's not the case that every single book needs to reflect every single student all the time. But it is really important that students need to sometimes see themselves in the materials that you're presenting in the classroom, right? They need to have mirrors so that their experiences are validated. And in addition to that, because we don't want students to only see things about themselves, we also want to make sure that they have mirrors into other experiences that they themselves don't have. Incredibly, incredibly important. And just as a really quick personal anecdote, so I grew up in the United States as an immigrant. I moved here when I was 3 years old and grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then moved to Portland, Oregon. In the entire time I was in K through 12 education, I did not once have a book that was written by an Asian author, except for one. And that was Lon Po Po, which was an old folk tale, basically Little Red Riding Hood. And it was about a wolf that ate children. So in my head, all the way from when I was 5, all the way until I was 18, my entire experience, I loved reading, I loved writing, I became an English major, I became an English teacher. But at the time, I was convinced that Asian people did not write books. I was like, none of my friends wrote books. None of my parents had friends that wrote books. I was like the only person who really liked English class who also happened to look like me. So I thought I was sort of one of a kind. And I remember when I went to college and I was selecting electives, and I saw an elective for Chinese literature. And I actually remember laughing and turning to my roommate and saying, they're offering Chinese literature. What could they possibly be reading in that class? Not realizing that there were thousands of years of literature that I had never been exposed to simply because it never came up in my schooling. Let me turn to that page. And this leads to this last quote by poet Adrienne Rich. When someone with the authority of a teacher describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into the mirror and saw nothing. And you can go ahead and click next. So I'm going to end here before I get to questions with just one other question for people in the chat to put in the chat. So the first thing is, have you ever experienced a time in school when you saw nothing? And to the extent that you're comfortable with, I'd love for you to describe that experience for the chat. And if you do have that, please let me know. And if you didn't ever experience this, why? And I'll give you a second, just type some stuff, and then we'll take a look at the chat. So Jennifer Bloom says, no, I never saw this. I'm white, right? I saw a lot of representation for me. So Kate talks about very little experience, limited experience as a female interested in higher level math, didn't see a whole lot of representation or role models around that. And then Jaylene says, no, I didn't see this until I went to college for engineering. Again, college happens to be a lot of my own personal experiences when my mind was expanded with all these other identities and all these different things. Jaylene, that really resonates with me. Eva talks about, as a white academically gifted student, I was praised a lot and explicitly. Alicia talks about teaching overseas, it was difficult to find Moroccans. Maria talks about there weren't that many references to Hispanic people or literature. And as you kind of move forward, I do really want to emphasize this does impact your students if they aren't represented, if they don't see themselves. Sometimes your students will not even know how it impacts them until many, many, many years down the road, when suddenly they see something, they're like, what? I had no idea this was the case, right? And I'm going to read this one last one before we transition, which Rachel says, an ESL student facing word problems, student with poverty issue to figure out what patio means, right? Like all of these things are real things that came in. And actually, I'm going to read one more because they're starting to come in. So Catherine, she talks about coming from a single parent household, and most books and texts showed two parents. And she often felt like her family is wrong or not normal. And it left me feeling empty and unsure of things. And this also happened with my experience with people with poverty not going to college, right? This is all really real, and it really impacts our students. So thank you all for sharing. I really, really appreciate that.
And thank you, Steven. If you can just stick around for a couple of minutes, there might be more in the chat or a question. Just in the interest of time, unfortunately, we're going to move on. But if we're lucky, another time we'll get a chance to work with you and we'll have a longer period of time. Thank you very much. All right, I just wanted to call attention to 3 texts because a lot of your questions were about recommendations for reading materials. And there are links to Steven's resources in that resource document. And then here are 3 others that are well respected. And we have some experience with actually one of them, Goldie Muhammad, hosted a webinar with us a couple of years ago, and Geneva Gay's book was really the driving force behind Tracy Swinton Bailey's presentation that I talked about a little earlier on culturally responsive literacy. We haven't had the luck of having Zaretta Hammond yet, but maybe someday. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Karen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. Thank you so much to Steven. I learned a lot. So I'm going to talk to you about voting rights, particularly women's suffrage, and some of the things that I've learned, particularly using all of the resources I'm going to show you. And I'm going to show you a lot, and we have all of these resources for you. If I go over something quickly, hopefully you'll be able to find it. So my first thing is about assumptions and biases when it comes to history, but in this particular case about voting. And I think it's really important to assess our own bias on this subject. So if we take the assumption that voting is fundamental and essential as a right in democracy, I would ask my questions, and I'm asking you this question now about who has the right to vote. And so if you would use the chat and just put some things in there. And the reason why I'm asking this is because it's more complicated than it appears on the surface. And it will help you understand the context of where your students are coming from on this issue. So if you would please in the chat, just a few lines about who has the right to vote? What do you think? So I'm starting to see some things, and I will just read a couple of things. People who have been granted the power, not as many as we believe. Depends on where you live. And I am talking about the United States right now. Thank you for that clarification. Citizens of a country, everyone who's a citizen. And I'll let you continue to keep watching the chat and see what people answer. And one of the things too is asking those questions is just to get a sense of where your students are at with that. So up until a few years ago, I had been learning and unfortunately teaching sort of the standard line of what I knew about the suffrage leaders in America. And you probably, and maybe some of your students have heard the names of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Carrie Chapman Catt, who we actually have a lot of resources on, and I will reference her a little bit later again. But what about these names? Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass as a suffrage leader for women's right to vote. Mary Talbert, for example, was a civil rights leader, and that's who that's images of. And she was one of the leaders with the early NAACP. She wrote an article called Women and Colored Women, which I think the quote from the article is very much, I think, what was reflected for Black women in the right to vote. And she said this: with us as colored women, the struggle became twofold. First, because we are women, and second, because we are colored women. And that's really where I feel there is so much to learn. And one of the questions is, well, how do we learn about things that we might not have been taught ourselves? And I'm going to show you some resources here that's really going to help with that. Next slide. So one of the things I've done a lot of work with that's really, really engaging is American Experiences the Vote. And it's a 4-hour film that outlines the decade leading up to the 19th Amendment, so leading up to 1920. And within the vote, there is all kinds of historians, really, really interesting historians, and history that some of it that I didn't know. And a lot of the story is told by voices that we haven't heard from as important in the movement. And within the vote, there is an interactive, so associated with that. And the interactive is called She Resisted. And in that, there are a couple of things that I would like to highlight for you in ways that you can learn about voting rights for women, and also that your students can learn. So next slide, please. So one of the things in this interactive is this interactive map. And on the right-hand side, you can see it says pick a year. It's going from 1910 to 1920. And I didn't actually pick any year because I wanted all of you to see what the United States looked like pre-1910. And actually in 1910, the idea of voting rights will come up in a couple of states. We can see that by the key. So I always point out the key to students, or actually I ask them to tell me what they see. And for visual learners, you know that maps are excellent for visual learners. So there were 4 states that at the time of 1910, there was actually state rights to vote, and that was Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and in the list, Idaho in 1896. So the last state that allowed any voting for women on a state level was 1896. And you can see, again, this map is from 1910. So despite the fact that there was the 15th Amendment, which allowed voting rights for Black men, there was no voting for women on a national level, women of any color at all. The star at the bottom, just I want to recognize the star on the bottom right, is as you start clicking through the different years, that little star will appear and it will tell you a special interest story about something that happened in a particular state or a particular city. Next slide, please. So one of the things that is going to happen with the right the right to vote for women is I had the assumption and the bias when I first started learning about this, that all the women were working together because voting was so critically important in a democracy and that this was a cohesive movement. And I'm going to ask Carolyn in just a minute to show you a little clip of one of our resources. And the resources, there's a collection on women's suffrage, and there are some short videos and some teacher help pages with tips about how to teach them. But one of the big questions that's going to arise is, should the right to vote be for all women or only some women? And I'm going to have you see this short video, about a minute and a half.
As states across the South moved to bar Black men from voting, by means of grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, and brute force, the National Association, with Susan B. Anthony's assent, adapted to the prevailing mood. African-American women who had been prominent in the movement were sidelined, and Southern chapters permitted to refuse Black members. In 1894, Anthony even went so far as to ask Frederick Douglass to keep away from a suffrage convention in Atlanta for fear of alienating potential supporters.
Frederick Douglass is the one who stands up and says to women who are ambivalent about calling for the vote, but you must work for suffrage. So to say to him that he's not welcome in the South in Atlanta is a terrible thing. And Anthony probably actually believed that, as she said, when we get the vote, when white women get the vote, we'll make everything okay for everybody. But it certainly encouraged the continuing segregation and discrimination.
Thank you. So there's a number of clips like that that can really help to teach your students a greater story. Next slide, please. So and another part of the interactive is the strategies that women use to try to win the right to vote. And you can see there are 9 buttons, and when you click on a button, it takes you to a different strategy. And so lesson ideas that I've used with these buttons is to investigate what some of the strategies were with my students. And I have done comparisons from then and now. I've assessed values and limitations of what the women in the decade before the 19th Amendment, what worked for them, what didn't. One of the things that was an interesting spin in this divided movement was that Black women will start forming clubs for change, or women's clubs. And you see an image right there of a club that formed in Rhode Island. And women, Black women, started creating clubs for a variety of different reasons. Some was for general civil rights and improvements in their communities. And then part of it was also for women's suffrage for everybody. Next slide, please. So I want to highlight just quickly, just two activists that I hope you do a deeper dive into. And Ida B. Wells is one of them, and you might know of her from her anti-lynching campaign. As a civil rights activist, she was a journalist. And you might not know that she was the founder of a suffrage club in Chicago. And her club in 1914 decided to lead a voter registration drive, and they were able to register 23,000 new voters, which is just incredible, incredible feat. There are a couple of resources for her that you might want to dive into in the interactive for the vote. Under women's clubs, you'll find a lot of information on her. Also, there is a collection under Reconstruction from PBS LearningMedia, and she's also highlighted in there. Next slide, please. Another activist I encourage you to look at is Mary Church Terrell, who was a contemporary of Ida B. Wells. And she was someone who helped to found the National Association for Colored Women. just a note that there are amazing biographies of women at the National Women's History Museum website, and we're going to provide the link for you for that. There is a collection that PBS LearningMedia has been working with a resource called Unladylike. And Unladylike, I will actually read quickly something from the Unladylike website, but it says it's a comprehensive biographies of 26 bold American women who broke barriers in male-dominated fields at the turn of the century and women who followed in their footsteps. And within that, there is a section called Women's Suffrage in the Progressive Era, and Mary Church Terrell is highlighted there with an interactive for your students. There is a video and questions that students can answer right in the video. And I encourage you to take a look at that. That one is a preview for content teachers because there will be some images of lynching, and you want to make sure that's appropriate for your students. Next slide, please. And as we're talking about the 19th Amendment, you have to, as a history teacher, show the primary document. And I'm always struggling of how do I do pieces of the Constitution. And so we have resources that help you with learning media. You have a transcript, you can see the original document, which is really fun for students. There's some images here and some help of how to teach this. And in 1920, you might say the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. And we would hope that that was the end of the story. Next slide, but it isn't. And so I would take this to look at the 19th Amendment and today. I was very excited about the resources that we have to offer, and I actually have highlighted 4 different things. A selection of videos that can help your students understand where voting is right now for women. And also, if you see all the way to the right, there is a picture with a caption underneath it. And in the Vote Interactive, there's a section called Legacy, where young voters, first-time voters for the 2020 election, talk about why they're voting. And I think this is something that you can absolutely do with your students, is ask them after you or at some point in your lesson about how they feel about voting. And this is a great time to use any sort of method that they want, TikTok, meme, blog, journal, and let them use their imagination to express how they feel. Next slide, please. And lastly, there are a number of organizations, and many of you may have been following the recent years of Stacey Abrams. She would be a really excellent modern day activist, Black woman activist for voting rights, and her organization, Fair Fight. Also, I highly encourage you to take a look at the national website for the League of Women Voters. And in particular, when you go there, you'll understand what the League does on a national level, but then it will direct you to the state organizations and organizations in your area. And they are an excellent partner to learn about what's happening in your area for voting. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Carolyn. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Karen. I just want to give a heads up to everyone that we are running a little behind, but I don't want to rush the presenters. We'll try and keep to time, but if we go over a little bit and you need to leave, we certainly understand, and there will be a recording, but we have a lot of information to share. I just wanted to mention quickly that the vote that Karen referenced is available for streaming on the American Experience site. And this is what the resource looks like on PBS LearningMedia. And again, you will have the links to all of that. And we also ran a webinar on the vote featuring, Karen was actually on a couple of them. This one featured Marcia Chatlin, who is an African-American Studies and US History professor at Georgetown, and the author of a book that just won the Pulitzer Prize, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America. And she is featured in the program, The Vote, and she also was a lead presenter in one of our webinars. We were thrilled to have her. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie. We're going to shift gears now to science.
make sure everyone can hear me. We're going to talk about science, my very, very favorite subject. So I just kind of want to go back to what Mr. Chen talked about and how anti-bias and culturally responsive pedagogy fits into science. So as we all understand, science is always going to be the study of phenomenon based on empirical evidence, usually through some sort of investigation. It's usually pretty cut and dry when it's taught. So most people don't think anti-bias applies there, but it really can. So it's important for science educators especially to have it be their goal to let every child see themselves in the science classroom, because science is everywhere and science is for everyone. One of the pinnacles of bias is invisibility. So many of our students, especially those of color and minorities, feel invisible in the standard science classroom. So how do you begin to make that anti-bias classroom? Well, you need to get to know your students and build relationships. So ways to do that, here's some ideas: do some surveys about their interests, have lunch and learns, and really just take the time to get to know who you are teaching. Next slide. All right, so can your students see themselves in your curriculum? So textbooks and standard things that we teach in science are filled with the wonderful contributions of mainly old white males. But we know that our classrooms are not just white males. So are all of your students seeing themselves in the classroom? So PBS Learning has some great little clips. For the sake of time, we won't play any of these because there's some other clips I would like to show, but of different scientists of many different backgrounds doing many different interesting things. So if you can learn to incorporate these things into your classroom, it would allow your students that typically won't see themselves in your textbooks to see what other people that look like them are doing in the science field. All right, next slide. All right, so as a teacher, it's your responsibility to connect the dots of your curriculum with the issues, conditions, and genres that interest your students. So how do you do that? You have to find something that's relevant to them and tie it to a standard. So we understand that there are some topics that are a little cut and dry. So atomic structure, you may not be able to tie that back to their culturally responsive pedagogy, but there are other topics you certainly can. And the impact that you will have on those students by making the effort to connect them to the standards will make those other cut and dry subjects a little bit more tolerable, and they will be more engaged into your classroom. So science is everywhere in everything that we do. So pick a topic and just tie it to a standard. Next slide. All right, so the collection I'm going to be covering from PBS Learning is called Blood Sugar Rising, America's Hidden Epidemic. This is a phenomenal resource. It has so many different collections of videos, questions, and the standards as well, for you to be able to incorporate it into many different science classrooms. All right, so in the populations that I served while I was in the classroom and even now support as a specialist, many of my students live in what we call food deserts. I'm pretty sure that we are all familiar with the idea of a food desert. So living in a food desert really impacts how your health and your eating habits will develop. And one of the things that we find with individuals that live within food deserts is the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. Next slide. So within this collection, there are many different ways you can start to begin that culturally responsive pedagogy. This is an excellent piece called Using Poetry to Raise Diabetes Awareness. So typically, historically, we only saw type 1 diabetes in children, but in recent years with the diet, the rise in food deserts, the American diet being the way that it is, type 2 diabetes is becoming more and more prevalent among children, especially children of color and or children that live in low income areas. So this project allowed students to use poetry as a way to connect their understanding to diabetes. So right now we're going to watch about a 1.5 minute clip of how they use this.
Whenever I tried to take the step back and look at the bigger picture that was causing the type 2 diabetes epidemic, the food systems, the poverty, the food insecurity. When I tried to bring these things up with policymakers, it was glazed eyes, and I was doing it till I was blue in the face. And it was then I realized that maybe just I'm not the guy to be transmitting this information, because clearly it's not effective. Maybe I really need to turn to the community and identify community spokespeople who could be powerful voices for change from within.
Even at large, or just Oakland in general.
And that realization really led to the creation of what's now called the Bigger Picture Campaign, which is a collaboration with youth of color, poets, who really tell the story about the bigger picture behind the type 2 diabetes epidemic.
So try to jot down any like last minute stuff you're thinking of. For raise your hands in here, how many people in here know somebody with type 2 diabetes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out of 8. That's like what, 90+% of the room, right? That's wild. The art of being able to illustrate the urgency of an issue through words in a way that like people otherwise wouldn't be able to hear it or process it is really important. And I think that it's an opportunity to turn heads to the issue of type 2 diabetes in a way that like hasn't necessarily.
Whenever I try to
All right, so I think this was an excellent way to involve your students. Many of you have students that are into the arts and they don't really necessarily feel connected with science all the time. This is a way for those students that love to do creative writing, that are into hip hop, to be able to incorporate their interest into the science classroom, especially if we're talking about health issues and diseases, body systems in science class. Next slide. So PBS LearningMedia provides lots of support materials with these videos that make it easier for you to figure out how you can incorporate this into your classroom. So they have some probing questions here that you can use before showing this video to students. I'll read one of the examples. Do you have a connection to diabetes either personally or through a family member or friend? So those kind of things can begin conversations and pique the interest of students, because I'm pretty sure if you took a survey in your classrooms, you're going to find students that are affected by type 2 diabetes. Even some of your students may have type 2 diabetes. Next slide. Also, they will tie it to your state standards. I live in Florida, so when I go to the standards portion of this collection, it will show me standards in the Next Generation Sunshine State Standards. But when you log into PBS and you put in the state that you live, you will be able to tie that to standards within your state, which I think is an excellent, excellent resource. So our next piece is in that collection is about how in New York City, the coronavirus affected type 2 diabetes. Now, we all know that the coronavirus is culturally relevant to everyone at this time because it's affecting the whole entire world. So how does the rise in diabetes plus the pandemic affect people in certain communities? In this particular video, we won't watch a clip of it, but it's a very interesting story about someone with type 2 diabetes that was trying to get it under control with exercise outdoors, how it affected them during the shutdown in New York City when they were not able to get exercise. And it just talks about her trials and tribulations through that experience. Next slide. All right, there are also great supporting materials for this. I put some additional questions that are not in PBS that you can tie it to other things. A lot of them are the health standards, something that you see in a health or PE class. But if you're teaching general science or biology, you can ask questions like, what body systems are directly affected by type 2 diabetes? What body systems are directly affected by the coronavirus? And also, based on your understanding of body systems, why is diabetes considered a comorbidity for those affected by COVID-19? So you're not just limited to the standards that are on PBS Learning. Use a little creativity. You can input that in any class. And one of my favorite portions of this collection is the story of Karen Washington. She is from the Bronx, and she became an urban farmer in her area based on the food desert that she lived in. So if you're an environmental science teacher, you can tie in environmental science into this collection as well. And you can have students talk about, is their neighborhood considered a food desert and how would they know that? So next slide.
In the Bronx, one of the #1 dye-related diseases is type 2 diabetes. Everyone knows a family member, a friend, a colleague who suffers from type 2 diabetes, which can be prevented. This is the tale of two cities. Here in the Bronx, we are surrounded by unhealthy food. We have the bodegas. You open the door, and the first thing that hits you are the racks of cookies and cakes and candies and sodas. And then you go into more affluent neighborhoods, and I walk into the store, and there are the vegetables. Here are the healthy food options. But the question I ask is why? Why does
All right, and this part of the collection really goes into how Miss Washington took her understanding of being a part of a food desert, combined it with her love for farming, and she created a whole urban farm, and she sells produce right in the Bronx. And being someone from that area, I can attest that it truly is a food desert, and it really is. If you're on one side of town, you have nothing but fast food, and the other side of town, you have a plethora of healthy options. There are some resources for this as well. Some vocabulary words like bodega. If you're not from the New York City area, you might not know what a bodega is. You might need to explain that to your students. So they give you a plethora of vocabulary to use. And here are some questions. What are requirements to have a successful garden? What biological processes are involved? This is a way for you to tie in things like photosynthesis and cellular respiration, if you're covering that in your class. And then what are key components needed in the soil for a successful garden, or what kind of climate is needed? So these are different ways and different angles from many different science courses you can use this particular portion of the collection. Next slide. And I'm turning it back over to the host.
Great, thank you, thank you, thank you very much. This is just a reminder that the collection for Blood Sugar Rising, this is the link on PBS LearningMedia. And again, we did have a webinar, and Karen Washington was featured on the webinar. We had the great pleasure of working with her, and the recording to that is available to you. We're switching gears now, and again, I want to apologize for being behind schedule. We are scheduled to go till 8:15. We know that if you need to leave, of course, please do so. We are recording, and we'll try and keep our final remarks brief and give a little more time for Q&A. So our next presenter, Annie from PBS Utah, is going to be introducing you to an interactive lesson. An interactive lesson is a special kind of animal. It's a special kind of resource on PBS LearningMedia. And these are lessons that are comprised of a series of screens that a student can do independently or in a small group or whole class, self-paced, very flexible. A lot of media, a lot of short text reading, assessment, engagement activities, all part of that. And on the right-hand side, I've just given you a smattering of some of the topics that are covered on these interactive lessons. There are hundreds of them on the site for K-12 across the curriculum. And we're going to hear from Annie about one that her station produced.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to acknowledge the great educators that have gone before me in this presentation. And I'd like to take a second to honor all of you that are here, because clearly it's a priority for you. I'm setting my alarm so that I can make sure I don't go too much over time. So I really appreciate that you're here. You're taking your time to learn about this. And I think that's something to acknowledge, that this is a process. Becoming anti-bias, becoming more inclusive. There's no way to like check the box and say, I'm done. And there's a lot of different diversity that isn't always visible just by looking at someone. And so when it comes to creating that safe space, and I love the word space, I kind of think it reminds me of place plus safe, but that would really be splace, which is kind of a funny word. But I love the word space, and that's really what we need to create in our classrooms, is this caring, respectful, inclusive space. And if you are a female or were socialized as a female, you probably remember that those times in junior high and high school when people were standing around in a circle and gabbing, and just very minutely, you could see someone kind of shift their shoulder and box somebody out a little bit. And often when it was said, oh, why did you do that? Or why did you leave me out? Many times we don't necessarily recognize that we're doing it, but the person that's on the outside of that circle recognizes it. And I think we have to look at, a lot of times we say having a place at the table for everybody. I kind of think of that circle of gals typically that kind of box out someone. And what are we doing to really open up our circle and make sure that everyone is able to be a part of the conversation? So I think it's important for us to be learners and take off our teacher hat on occasion and learn from our community rather than just talking at them. Instead, have that reciprocal language and that dialogue. It's important to try to avoid absolute language. So none, everyone, all. And also, looking at creating that space for those who are neurodiverse, gender and gender expression, and recognizing how that comes into play in your classroom. So I think we can move along to the next slide. So we at PBS Utah created this interactive lesson, Bears Ears National Monument, and it is based on a documentary that PBS Utah did called The Battle Over Bears Ears. And we can head to the next slide. So one thing that we did as filmmakers built a relationship of respect and really got to know the community of the people that were in the surrounding areas around Bears Ears. There are a lot of different Native American tribes that are in that area, and it impacted a lot of different people. We here in Utah, we are very used to talking about Indigenous communities, and there is still a great divide. And so the battle over Bears Ears was and continues to be a big issue with what is a national monument, what's protected land, who does land belong to, who should oversee that land, who should protect it and govern it and create the rules around it. So as an education team, we hired a professional educator who is also a Native American, and we wanted to make sure to amplify that voice. I wish she could have been here with us tonight. But it's important to really hear from people that are more involved in the story rather than kind of being a journalist and just telling the story. So this became a conflict over, it was political, it was cultural, it was spiritual, it was economic, a lot of different things went into it. So next slide, we're gonna head over to LearningMedia and look at the interactive lesson. And as we're kind of getting there, I want to acknowledge that those of us who grew up in Utah, I went to an elementary school called Indian Hills. And as I look back at my yearbooks, it is completely inappropriate what we had as a part of our upbringing. And I think that when it comes to Indigenous communities and Native American tribes, we still have a long way to go. I don't think that we know enough in general and in our education and in the field of education of really making sure that we are being sensitive and inclusive. And so we at the University of Utah did a mascot change in the 90s. Growing up, there was something predominant that was going on here in our culture called the Indian Placement Program, where children were taken from their families and put into foster homes and put into schools. And so there's a lot of background. It's something that is a sensitive topic. It's something that is important to us. And many people feel a strong opinion or feelings about this. So this lesson, if we can go to slide 2, that would be excellent. We're going to quickly watch just a little bit about Bears Ears.
This is the Bear's Ears, and it's alive, and it has its own spirit, it has its own agency, its own power, and its own gift.
These resources are too valuable, they're irreplaceable. It's like tearing pages out of a history book. And once they're gone, they're gone.
Tension is growing in the southeastern corner of Utah. Native Americans propose a new national monument called Bears Ears to honor the region's significance.
This is an example of public lands. It belongs to the people that live on the East Coast to the West Coast. This is going to set the tone for other public lands conversations throughout the nation.
But many townspeople oppose the monument.
This is more than recreation to me. This is my home. For the government to come in and make this monument and take away the freedoms that we enjoy here, it's like taking America away from me.
The very tool that you want to use to protect something is the very thing that will bring people in to destroy it.
Who has the final say in how the region is managed and protected? The Bears Ears debate will challenge local versus national control, presidential power, and Native American sovereignty. It will tear apart a community, and it will reflect the deep divides in our nation.
All right, let's go over to slide 9 to kind of finish up here. As you'll see, as with all of the learning media curriculum, there are assignments alongside it, and it is tied to different standards, educational standards, local and federal. And then also you can link it to your classroom and really use this as a tool. So what I also appreciate about this interactive lesson is that the conversation, we're not telling children what to think or students what their opinion should be, but we're giving them the information and then creating a safe space to have this dialogue. So this is a great interactive lesson to do for remote learning if there's an asynchronous or synchronous time. It's also great in pairs or small groups, in discussions. But before you can really do a lesson like this, you have to have already created a classroom community that's very open and safe, and that people feel like they can be heard. So here there's, after each slide, there's either pictures or there's video. And then on this one, it's write a short paragraph explaining the pros and cons. And this is a lovely documentary. And I know that, students get really excited every time something technology-wise is played. I don't think it's like the olden days, where you'd get really excited when the teacher would move the card in, but there still is that excitement. And this is a beautiful opportunity for us to really highlight and amplify the voices of Native Americans and Indigenous people. And as a Utahn, it's very important to get an unbiased storytelling from the people who are living closest to this monument. So it's a very special and beautiful lesson, and something that I think that we need to really pay attention to in terms of how we are dealing with that inclusion aspect of things and creating a space for all different types of students, especially those who may not even necessarily have a high population in our schools. So I appreciate your time for being here tonight. It's important that we have these conversations and recognize that this is just the beginning of this dialogue. This is something that is, I've watched this, diversity conversation going on for the last 20 years, and it's ever evolving, and it's exciting to be in there and a part of it. And I would just prompt you and give you the courage to question those bias conversations that come up, the things that we see. It is our role to be anti-bias and to create an inclusive environment. And we do that through what we teach, but we also do it in how we live and who we are. So we appreciate you as educators being committed to this. Thank you.
And thank you, Annie. Yeah, I love your word. It is a beautiful, interactive, and just lovely. Very nicely done. Thank you. Again, I want to acknowledge that we have gone over our time in presentation. I apologize for that. I promise you that we have taken all your questions seriously, and we will be hosting more of these, and there will be more time for open dialogue with experts in the field. So that is coming. I'm just going to end with some quick slides. Again, you will have access to all of these slides. I want to give a nod to math. Several of you asked questions about how can math teachers do this? We've done a lot of work in math, culturally responsive teaching of math. And there are documents, professional development documents that were just created last year that link to videos and give wonderful, authentic lesson ideas. So I encourage you to look at the Math at the Core collection on Learning Media. The iconic lesson that was done in the 60s, I believe, A Class Divided, the Blue and Brown Eye study that probably many of you know from Frontline, that is also on Learning Media. We ran a webinar on using culturally responsive teaching for math, and you'll have the link to that. That was for grades 5 through 8 plus Algebra 1. This is a lovely collection of indigenous voices from Barrow, Alaska, and talking about climate change. Steven, in some of his presentations that I've been in with him, has mentioned this collection as particularly as an exemplar. So that's another one to check out. Above the Noise is a very interesting collection produced by KQED out in San Francisco. Very popular. Young, hip people are speaking about current issues and to a teenage audience. And you can see on the left-hand side here all of the topics that are covered by many, many videos in this collection. Videos are all short, by the way, 3 to 5 minutes. Unresolved is another project that I would encourage you to look at on Learning Media. This is from Frontline also. This was just, there was a related production on television. I think it was last night or the night before. And so you'll have the link to that. This is all about unsolved civil rights cases throughout history. And we did a webinar on that too. We do a lot of webinars here. And last but not least, all right, so here is the survey link. Angelica, I'm sure, has put that in the chat. When you close out of the webinar, this might open up in a separate browser window. That's what the goal is. I'll see if it actually works for you. And we keep the survey open for about a week. It's handled by our research department. It's anonymous. We take your feedback very seriously. And after you take the survey, you can download a certificate that acknowledges that you participated tonight. I spent a little time putting together a folder on Learning Media. When you log into Learning Media, you can save resources. It's called favoriting the resource by clicking on a little heart, and that takes your favorite resources to a folder that you then can create other folders. So I created a folder for tonight with all of the resources that you saw on Learning Media in it, plus many, many more. And I'll probably keep adding to it because I never feel like I'm done. There's always one more favorite I want to put in. So you're welcome to check out that folder and let us know what you think. All right, thank you. If the presenters want to come back on camera, I know that Steven is no longer with us, but thank you so much to Karen Pleasant for the social studies teacher extraordinaire, and Leslie White. I look forward to working with you. Leslie is going to be presenting on a webinar coming up on March 8th, featuring resources from NOVA. And we're thrilled to have her again. And Annie, welcome. to the PBS world. I hope we get another chance to work together. And thank you to all of you. Thanks to Angelica for handling the chat. We'll keep the chat open for a few more minutes. Again, I apologize for not planning the time. Yeah, I just slipped up in planning the time and mapping this out. So we went over time, but anyway. All right, does anyone have any final remarks you'd like to make? And we'll keep the chat open for a little bit. Everybody's good? Okay. All right, we'll keep the chat open and then wish you a wonderful evening. Hope to see you again. And thank you again for all that you do.